I'm Brian Kardell. I'm a developer advocate at Igalia, and I'm helping do this recurring series for posterity, and hopefully it's just generally interesting about the history and evolution of the web, conversations with people who are there along the way. Hopefully, gaining some good information and stories that we'll now have forever. So last time at BlinkOn 13, I talked to Darren Fisher and Ben Galbraith, which we reminisced about some very, very early days of the web. And this time I'm here with two other friends at Google.
I'm Ben. Hey, everybody. I lead the product side of the web platform team. So we talked about Ben Galbraith a moment ago. I work very closely with Ben, and I work very closely with this other guy, Dion. In fact, he'll give a little bit of our background in a minute, but we've worked together for Dion, I want to say 15 years. Is that right?
I think even more, maybe, yeah.
Even more. That's probably true on various aspects of the web. So before we started working together here at Google, we were together at Walmart Labs, where we were working on Walmart's digital experiences, their website, their mobile apps. And then before that, we were at Palm working on WebOS together. And before that, we were at Mozilla working on developer tools together. And then before that, we were doing this thing called ajaxian.com, which was a media property and conference series that a blog, I guess I should say, conference series that was covering the Ajax movement. And before that, we had different gigs, but we would travel around the US and give talks together on the same conference circuit. And I'll pass it over to you, Dion.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, that large media conglomerate that we ran on the side for a while, called Jackson. Yeah, I've just before that I was actually working at Google for the first time, where I got to work on fun things like Google Gears. Before we had the Chrome itself, which was a lot of fun too, and then a bunch of the migration to HTML5 and all of the fun stuff that Hixie was very involved in wrangling back then. But yeah, right now I work with Ben and the other Ben Galbraith on the web ecosystem side. So anything to do with developer tooling and the like, and also kind of ecosystem pieces like helping WordPress and CMSs, or helping e-commerce platforms or frameworks, and really helping us kind of reach developers where they are.
Cool. So I said we had this common history of being involved with the web, but I think actually we have something else in our background, if I'm not wrong. I think all of us were kind of like into Java. Am I wrong about that?
No, we were big in the Java ecosystem back in the day. I think, Dion, you were more on the database side, right? And I was on the servlet side, and also Java Swing, their rich client technology, was something that I spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, I got into Java after many years of Perl, of all things, in the original .com fun. Building things like vitamins.com and all of these fun websites way back. And in Java land, I got particularly deep for a while in enterprise Java beans.
Yes.
EJB.
Yes.
Good. We're going to talk about those. Yeah. So I think that is important, because I feel like there's a way that this connects in a way. So let's kind of set the stage a little bit for anybody who's maybe even just needs a refresher, because it's been a long time, but lots of people weren't around. So, in the mid 90s, basically, the web before it didn't have JavaScript. It didn't have CSS. It wasn't scriptable. It had only very basic forms. And, you could kind of do applications. And so we started creating like application servers was an idea that how that would work. And, but the web was kind of gross for apps. Like it was not a great experience. Everything was completely round trip, whole page refresh. And there were no controls. Like I said, you couldn't script it. It wasn't very pretty. Very, very early apps weren't especially fun. But still, there was something appealing about it. And there was this idea that it should be scriptable. And so like Microsoft and Netscape both had their own ideas about what that should look like. And then there was this idea of an app server and ways to generate pages. And Microsoft and Netscape had their own ideas about that. But so did Java, Sun. And then there was also this common idea that maybe it should be the same on both sides, the same language that you would use, or at least highly related. And yeah, so the web was like it wasn't scriptable. There was no Ajax. There was no JSON. Well, I guess there was kind of JSON because Doug Crockford just sort of wrote it down. It always sort of existed. But yeah, everything was new and incompatible. And that's when we start getting to this era that we're going to talk about, which is where things begin to get standardized. And also Java kind of really enters the picture, and they do it with this hot Java browser. And it was in like major regular newspapers, not like trade organizations. It was big news. Can maybe somebody tell me about the hot Java browser, like what the reception of that, or like what was its architecture? Yeah.
No, like everything you're talking about, like I remember like it was yesterday, because it feels like you're totally right. Like there was this era initially, this sort of great enthusiasm of what the web made possible, which was a graphical canvas that was internet connected. And it was just such a new thing. I first did web development when I was 17, working for Acer, doing internal facing apps, and I was porting some of our Windows things to the web and had to roll a bunch of infrastructure in Perl, kind of what Dion alluded to. And it was cool, but you quickly ran into limitations because it wasn't really a rich platform. And we'd had GUI toolkits for decades at that point. A lot of us had expectations for what you could do in a user interface. And there was this sort of pent-up demand that was created, and that led to things like Flash being used for applications. It led to, we're going to talk about Hot Java in just a moment, but like things like Hot Java and evolutions of Java. And I think Microsoft had their own Silverlight thing for a while too. Like everyone wanted to get a real application platform, either over the top of the browser or some other internet distributed version of it. And Dion, tell me if this was your experience, but I think every week I'd have a meeting with some stakeholder where they just wanted us to do something with the web, and you just have to tell people the web can't do that, like a rich text editor or something like that. Like, no, sorry, you can't do that in the browser. And so into this sort of frustration, I'm getting the timing a little off, because if I recall, Hot Java actually came out probably 3 or 4 years before the scenario I'm describing, when it really came out. And the moment you're talking about, Brian, when like Entertainment Tonight and people like that would cover it, it was really crazy. But because the web was the thing, when Hot Java first came out, and you had like this animation, the twisting heads moving around, you remember that? That was like the thing. Because we had no facility for animation at all in the browser. Everybody was like, wow, this is the future. Never really took off from there. You know, Java was just, it was the Yahoo chat UI, the most mainstream version of an applet probably ever. It never really reached its potential for animations. I don't even think anyone implemented double buffering, as far as I can tell, for that period of time when it looked like it might be popular, and there was incompatibility issues and stuff like that. But there was just this, Brian, there's just this really pent-up demand for the web to be able to do real user interfaces along this era.
Definitely.
Now I'm thinking of like all of these names are coming back, like Marimba, you know, just like,
plugin era. That's right.
The plugin era, exactly. Just this like plethora of evolution in a different way for people to explore. And yeah, I remember writing a bunch of applets, and lots of we laugh at some of the slow loading screens that we see with single page apps today. Like, go back to the applets, just like, wait a second, booting up the VM, we get in there.
Yeah, on a dial-up too.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Like on a maybe Pentium 75 computer if you were lucky. Yeah, it's very difficult. But what I think is interesting about this is the thing that you were hitting on, Ben, which is like this idea of Hot Java being really popular and that everybody was clamoring for it, like it wasn't even really new. Like this idea of like a VM, which the browser itself could even be an application hosted by the VM, and inside the documents you could have more applications and stuff. Payway actually demonstrated this exact same thing with the Viola browser, which was like one of the very first browsers. And then Flash would repeat it. And I think it was like right there on the edge. It was like the adjacent possible that everybody thought would be the thing.
Yeah.
And so we started the W3C, and like very quickly we got like HTML3, HTML4, we got CSS, and we got the DOM. All those things were great. And we also got XML. And I remember XML at the time, like it seemed almost as popular as Java. Like it was the thing, right? Like it was gonna do everything. It was gonna make the world so great.
It did do everything for a period.
And what's interesting is that at this time they said, you know, HTML is done because like that web, it just wasn't very good. And we can do better. We can have like this rich internet application web, and we can have data documents that are with XML, and we can do transforms to XML, and we can query XML. And it seemed like there was just like no end of the XML things that we could or would be able to do. So I don't know about you, but like I was on board that train. Like,
yeah, don't you feel like there was this time like people undervalued the fact that a lot of people could easily onboard on the web and just start building some websites and kind of grow from there. And it was kind of like, okay, wait, the real engineers are coming now.
Yeah,
we've got all of the solutions. We're gonna like have the schema for the entire world all worked out, and then we'll be done. We'll have everything. And it was just a very kind of pure view of what better was, and it missed all of the other side effects.
In my talks and on my blog, I talk about how like at this time, like you know, when I heard like Tim Berners-Lee was going to head up this effort, you know, the guy who created the web and standards, I didn't know anything about standards. I think like Ben said he was 17. I think I was 20 or something like that. Standards, just they sounded really important, you know, and I just imagined based on what I read that they were, you know, sure, that makes a lot of sense. Like you just get the sort of Manhattan Project, all the greatest minds in a room, and they solve the problem, and then we'll be done, and they just tell us how to do it, and it will be great. All the problems will be solved. I sort of imagine that's how it would work, and I kind of think that maybe they imagined that too, really.
It's funny how both of these ecosystems we're talking about, the web ecosystem and Java, both had these moments, because you know the golden era of Java, which I still miss, was the one where we all just listened to Sun. Sun had a plan, and they'd tell us how to build applications, and we go to Java 1 every year and listen to the prophets on the mountain. And you mentioned EJB, Dion. For me, I think that was the thing that ended that era, where we all sort of said, like, I guess the emperor doesn't have any clothes.
Yes.
And the web to a degree went through that with XML, where I like right there with you, Brian. I think we all were just struggling to keep up. Everything was unfolding so quickly, and the architects of the internet, the architects of the web, because you know, I was young, I didn't know the difference between all these people, were saying this is the future. Then it's clearly the future. And then when it blew up spectacularly, then it also sort of created the same sort of dynamic where instead of the web being driven by this central force, you remember like specs too, we'd all like consume the latest spec and that was it. And like we'd get mad at the browsers that they didn't implement the spec, and it was all about the spec. And then kind of, I know chronologically there's probably several years here, but kind of in my mind around the same time, HTML shifted to the living spec, the XML stuff that we'd all been told was the future kind of, I mean, there wasn't an official moment, it just decayed. And then that's when Ajax came into the fore, which is really kind of flipping it on its head when we all said it's not about the spec, it's about what the browsers can do. And one of the things that changed here too is instead of looking at the spec that the browser asserted to support, you do tests to see what the browser could actually support. And it just sort of changed the whole the whole nature of the beast.
Yeah, it's funny how just pragmatism keeps kicking in, right? Like, I mean, with EJB, there were two notions of data related objects, right? Beam managed persistence and container managed, and you're like, oh, there could be, because of all these different use cases. In reality, Oracle wanted one, IBM wanted the other, and so instead we make the standard have both, right? And then I was on the JDO working group in the JCP, and it was just like, why are we even doing, relational databases anymore? We're all about object orientation. Like, that should be the way. And there's just like, theoretically, this will be the future. And then Hibernate comes along, and they're like, no, database is actually pretty good. How about we just give you a way to nicely access them? And that's actually what everyone wanted, because guess what? There's a whole slew of people that run reports and all kinds of stuff where they need SQL, right? So it's just funny how like the pragmatism kind of comes in and often ends up being the thing that wins the day.
I remember that moment when I was in the thick of grappling with all of this persistence layer complexity in Java and .NET, when they did .NET 2 and made their their model was result sets. It was just so, I wanted to cry. It was awesome to get back to the simplicity of the relational model.
Yeah, so actually, we're kind of into this thing already, but I wanted to say, like, in around 1998 or 1999, I think, is when W3C said the web is done. Like, not the web, but HTML is done, and we're going to go do this XML app thing. But like, if you weren't there, you missed this gap of like about a decade, where it was about a decade from then when we finally got like a real HTML5 specification. So all this stuff happened in sort of from 1998 to 2004. All this great stuff was happening, even though nothing was happening in standards. And then from 2004 to say 2008, it just kept going. And 2004 is interesting because what was happening in developer land is people were sharing things. Like, I know Ajaxian wasn't created in 2004 yet, right? I think it was 2005, but lots of things like Ajaxian were springing up. Like, people were blogging and sharing and doing sort of the opposite of big design, right? Like, they were like publishing a thing and people were like, oh, that sounds good. And they would try it and they would say, it could be better. Let's like iterate and trade ideas. And I don't know, does anybody, like, I sort of feel like this is a really interesting thing, that we had all these sort of best, brightest minds in a room with all the companies behind them. And they were like, this web it's not good at apps. Like, it's really gross. Like, we don't want to do that. But developers kept using the tools that we have. And I feel like there was this like golden age in that decade. Yeah. Even though standards did nothing.
Right. Well, even like, talking about Ajax and XML HTTP requests, right? It's just so interesting. Where did that come from? It comes from Microsoft. Is it just from the browser team? No. It's from Exchange, and right, wanting to be able to do things. And so someone builds an ActiveX control, and fast forward, like, that's where the evolution comes in, right? From this, again, more of the plugin type model that we can then take in and bring elsewhere. Now, if you start with the web, you've got this, this object that's native to the web that I can just use on Navigator. That's not how it was created. You were used to, all of the early times, like testing for the different names of the ActiveX control to make sure you get the right one. It came from that view of just like, what can this thing even do?
No, I think that's totally, it was the closest thing to like a knowledge gold rush that I think I've ever seen in my career, because like we'd all studied the specs. We knew what the sort of web gods had told us was possible on the platform. And then to discover that there was this thing just sitting in the browser that, like Dion, like you said, had been there. And I think by the time Ajax really hit, Mozilla had already implemented it so that they could deal with compatibility issues that had cropped up because people had written web apps that only worked with IE. And so to have that just sitting there, it caused everyone to sort of feel like, well, what else is possible? Because this is a huge thing to have missed. What else have we missed? And it was just so exciting. And then we'd had this unholy bridge over to Flash, and people would try to figure out what you could build using both together. And I mean, as you all know, like every day, it seemed like we were discovering something new, and the whole community was just watching kind of in awe, whether you were a designer and you were like realizing that the shackles that had bound you for so long were now breaking off, or you were a developer, or you were a business stakeholder. Everyone was just sort of watching in awe at the fact that the platform could do all these things that we never really realized. And I think the Google Maps DOM hack, if you even want to call it a hack, landed at almost the same time, which didn't use originally XHR, at least for its core UI. And that was also another of these moments that just caused us to go like, wow, we didn't know the platform could do all this.
Yeah, I remember that time of like the push to kind of rebrand Ajax from, it's not like literally using this, just about using this technology. Obviously, most of it wasn't even XML from the get-go. It was just about delivering these higher quality experiences, right? And a lot of things that people would say are like birth of, great Ajax stuff, are things like Google Maps that didn't even use some of this stuff at the beginning, right? And there's just so many of those. And just seeing, just over the weekend, right, seeing people like Scott Schiller, created Sound Manager to be a bridge over to that world. Remember like Cipher, to be able to get like the fonts over from Flash. Right? It was just, everyone's just like grasping out. They wanted to do these things, and at least they had a way to either find things in the browser or through plugins, and like they had a way of kind of wrapping it all together and making it available that we can then come along as browsers and platform folks and underground that and bake it in.
Yeah, even these really, really basic ideas today, like we didn't have like query selector. And, like originally, I think you could get an element by ID. And I think there were like the live collections from DOM 0. There were like DOM collections where you could refer to basically like the tag names and IDs. But I think it was maybe Dean Edwards that did the first thing I saw that was like you could get them by the class too. And that was a really interesting. And then somebody else said, oh, but what if you could do this other thing? And like eventually through lots of libraries and ideas, we very rapidly got from nothing and this like really incompatible, painful to use, like, which, like, do you access the XML HTTP request object, or is it an ActiveX thing that you have to go through? Which event model do you use? Because they're not compatible either. Like, I mean, it was like, do you remember how painfully uneven the web was? We got very quickly from that to jQuery, and you didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. And it was like the API for it was just like really nice and convenient. It had like a plugin model, which was like made it really easy for you to like add your own ideas to. And I think like that thing that you were talking about people just being passionate about it and like just having fun, and there not being huge egos where, people can sort of take your idea and do better, and then everybody gains from that.
Yeah, it was funny how like I always pictured the dojo folks, some of which we still work closely with today. It must just have been sitting back so often because they could just be like, we did that one already in dojo.foo, like they had a module for everything. But just the ergonomics, right? It was just like literally just like instead of dojo.byid, of being able to do $, and double $, and prototype and all of those kind of things. Just like, what's the minimal kind of surface area that will give me the biggest bang for the buck? And there's the browser compatibility side that you kind of needed a shim just to deal with that, like you're saying. And then there's just like the styles that people are like, right? Like the prototype folks, very tied to kind of Ruby type way of thinking that melded really nicely. jQuery functional, way of thinking. It was kind of really fun for people to just explore, different ways of thinking and fashion to build on top of things too.
It's so fun to remember that back in that era, like we didn't actually know how JavaScript worked as a community. Like it was really, you'd hardly ever use it. You'd use it when you had to. And part of Ajax was also just figuring out the language and how to create things that weren't globals everywhere and that whole journey. But there's just so much, Brian, that we all had to figure out together. And it took a while for it to start evolving, but then it feels like 3 or 4 years into it, maybe a little longer, things started to evolve really quickly. And I don't think it's ever changed since then. Things continue to evolve really, really fast since then.
There was a W3C workshop on this problem of web apps because we still had not realized a replacement. Things were getting very complicated. And yet the web kept flourishing. Like the web was doing more and more, better and better. And people were building like very rich apps increasingly with the web we have. And, that this thing was, what should we do about that? Should we maybe admit that you can make at least medium-sized apps? Maybe not real apps, whatever you want to call it. Maybe you still do that, but for the web we have, shouldn't we make like an HTML5? And like the W3C said no, and that's how we wind up with the What working group or What Wig.
I mean, it is interesting to look back and see. It will be very rational to say, we've got different protocol building blocks, HTTP, all of these different pieces. So why does HTML can just be one of them over here? It doesn't need to be so tied. It doesn't have to be like the one GUI toolkit to rule them all. So why don't we have others that could come in and that could render very differently on top of, a lot of the same stack? Like you could totally see someone making that case and thinking that that's going to be the natural future. And then you had a lot of the people back then talking about just data exchange, machines on the web and, that whole side of things. And so that's why XML makes a lot of sense. Like it should have more rigor for all of the machine stuff that we're going to do. And then there's the whole view of separating all of the concerns. And so we are going to, have very different user agent things going on. And so we want to keep it very, this whole semantic web world, like all of that stuff going on. And it's kind of interesting to think through it. Why really didn't that take off? Like why was it this, evolution on top of, the crappy platform that ended up winning out?
It is fascinating, the inertia that happens, or the momentum, however you think about it. But I think I would have predicted SVG to have done better than it did. Like we have awesome SVG implementations in the browsers. SVG, if you think about it logically, seems like a much better platform for creating interfaces, especially with the diversity of screen sizes and everything that are on the market. But we don't really touch it. And it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you talk to some of the team, like, why shouldn't developers use SVG? People will say like, well, it's just not as tested. It's just not as compatible. It's kind of buggy because people don't use it. So there's just not, it doesn't have that breakaway. But it is interesting, Dion, like a parallel universe where browser plugins were forced to create declarative artifacts that were rendered as though they were a different type of protocol. Would that have changed anything? It's fascinating to think about. The conversation we're having about specs, just one thing that I've always sort of wondered is the role that the decision to make HTML5 be an endless spec, a versionless spec played. Because up until that moment, it felt like we were getting such momentum with the notion of HTML5, of people reconverging on a spec, and of the industry feeling like this is it. And then it almost seemed like that all that energy dissipated in a moment when I guess we, Dion, Google at the time, decided not to do that. I look at that and I feel like there were good reasons to do it, but it feels like it was a shift change where all of a sudden now people didn't have a version to talk about. There wasn't like a moment when some new version would come out. Up before then, people talked about HTML5, Brian, like when is that going to come out? Because we have 4, when's 5 going to come out? And what's 6 going to be? Oh my gosh, what is it going to enable? And all that just kind of vanished. And I wonder if we sort of missed that or missed something like that as a community.
Yeah, and just stabilizing in general, right? It's like all of our browsers are shipping every 4-6 weeks. It's just like a constant dynamic system that's out there. that in many ways is so great now that developers can like, you know, pin to evergreen browsers, so to speak. But on the flip side, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow when a new browser, a new OS gets updated that affects your application. And so you do feel like you're like constantly kind of swimming, you know, in the stream at the same time. So yeah, would it be nice to have more anchor points? Like, you know, HTML6, should we bring it back? Maybe we can add a few more tags this time for modern application capability.
The logo's open source, we can just add the vector points.
Yeah.